Imagine a government vault, cold and secure, where reels of film are not stored as art, but as hazardous material. Films so toxic, so psychologically potent, that they are deemed too dangerous for public viewing. Tonight, we are not just making a list. We are unlocking that forbidden vault to conduct a comparative analysis. We will explore the two distinct types of toxic cinema that Germany has struggled to contain for nearly a century, locked away for decades. This is not a fantasy. In Germany, this vault exists, and it holds a dark, remarkable, and deeply revealing chapter of cinema history. What happens when cinema becomes a war crime? When a film director stands trial at Nuremberg alongside mass murderers? And what happens when the post-war films that try to tell the truth are rejected by the public for being too painful to watch? In Act 1, we will dissect The Poison, the sophisticated propaganda films that weaponize the art of cinema into a tool of mass psychological destruction. In Act 2, we will examine The Antidote, the brave and controversial post-war films that used cinema as a mirror, forcing Germany to confront the most uncomfortable truths about its own past. And in a new Act 3, we will enter the gray zone, exploring the deeply disturbing films that are perhaps both poison and antidote at the same time. This is the story of the duality of cinema, as the most potent poison and as the only possible cure. The regime understood the power of cinema better than any government before it. The Minister of Propaganda saw film not as mere entertainment, but as the most effective weapon for shaping the soul of a nation. The films he oversaw were not crude, obvious propaganda. They were sophisticated pieces of psychological seduction, designed to indoctrinate, dehumanize, and ultimately prepare an entire population for total war and industrial-scale genocide. First, they targeted the youth, the most impressionable minds. Hitler Youth Quex 1933 was one of the Third Reich's most effective and insidious recruitment tools. The film did not present boring political speeches. Instead, it brilliantly wrapped the regime's ideology in the comforting and familiar format of a coming-of-age adventure drama. It follows the story of Heini Volker, a working-class Berlin teenager who was torn between his brutish, alcoholic communist father and the appealing, wholesome camaraderie of the local youth chapter. The choice is presented as obvious and morally clear. Communist meetings are depicted as smoky, violent affairs, while the regime's gatherings feature idyllic camping trips, inspiring songs, and a powerful sense of genuine brotherhood. The protagonist eventually chooses his side, is murdered by the communists, and becomes a heroic martyr for the cause. His dying words, "Our flag flutters before us," became an anthem sung at youth rallies across Germany. The film's genius was its emotional manipulation. It didn't feel like propaganda. It felt like an inspiring adventure movie, seamlessly transforming indoctrination into entertainment. Next, they perfected the aesthetics of evil. Triumph of the Will, 1935, is not simply a documentary. It is a cinematic seduction, a work of terrifying beauty. The regime's leader gave its star filmmaker, Leni Riefenstahl, unlimited resources, allowing her to orchestrate the 1934 Nuremberg rally, not as a political event, but as a cinematic spectacle. Utilizing an unprecedented 30 cameras and a crew of 120, she employed groundbreaking filming techniques to transform political theater into a deeply religious experience. Her cameras glide through vast forests of swastika banners, soar above geometrically perfect formations of marching men, and capture the chancellor's speeches with editing rhythms that mirror powerful musical crescendos. Every single shot serves the mythology of power, making it appear eternal, inevitable, and transcendent. The film's most chilling achievement is making fascism look beautiful. Torchlight parades become flowing rivers of flame. Mass rallies are transformed into choreographed spectacles of unity. The leader emerges from the clouds in his airplane like a descending deity. The filmmaker's genius lay in her profound understanding that political movements succeed not through rational argument, but through overwhelming emotional manipulation. Finally, The Poison turned explicitly genocidal. Films like The Eternal Jew, 1940, and Judd Sus, 1940, were the regime's final, most deadly cinematic weapons. The Eternal Jew was disguised as a cold, anthropological study, using deceptive editing techniques to present Jewish people as a parasitic race. It juxtaposed images of rats emerging from sewers with footage of Jewish people in Polish ghettos, creating a visceral visual argument that bypassed rational thought. Judd Sus, on the other hand, was a sophisticated, big-budget historical costume drama. The film transformed a real historical Jewish figure into the living embodiment of every vile anti-Semitic stereotype. It was a massive blockbuster hit. The regime's authorities made it required viewing for SS troops and would screen it for local populations in occupied territories right before carrying out mass deportations. Cinema had become the final psychological preparation for mass murder. For his role in creating this cinematic weapon, the director of Judd Sus, Veit Harlan, became the only filmmaker to stand trial for crimes against humanity at Nuremberg. His crime was not pulling a trigger, but directing a film that killed people just as effectively as any bullet. After the war, Germany faced an impossible task: how to tell stories about its own monstrous past. For decades, German cinema largely avoided the subject. But eventually, a new brave generation of filmmakers began to create a cinematic antidote to the poison of propaganda. These were not easy or comforting films. They were deeply controversial works that forced the German public to look into an uncomfortable mirror, challenging the simple, self-serving post-war narratives about guilt, blame, and victimhood. The first forbidden truth they dared to tell was that of the humanity of the enemy. Wolfgang Petersen's 1981 masterpiece, Das Boot, was a revolutionary act. Instead of portraying German soldiers as one-dimensional thugs, Petersen locked the audience inside a claustrophobic U-boat with a crew of terrified young men. These characters are not ideological warriors. They are sailors trying to survive in a cramped, stinking metal coffin. The film masterfully humanized the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, without for 1 second excusing the crimes of the regime they served. The production itself was famously grueling, with Petersen keeping his actors in the cramped replica for months, forbidding them from seeing sunlight to achieve an authentic pallor. The film became an international sensation, nominated for 6 Academy Awards, because its harrowing portrait of fear and survival was universal. The next, and even more dangerous, truth to be confronted was that of the humanity behind terrible historical events. For nearly 60 years, German cinema had portrayed the dictator as a cartoonish villain, a mythical figure of absolute evil. Oliver Hirschspiegel's 2004 film Downfall, Der Untergang, shattered that taboo forever. The film drops the viewer into the final apocalyptic days inside the leader's bunker. Bruno Ganz's portrayal was terrifying not because of its overt evil, but because of its undeniable, pathetic humanity. This man shows kindness to his dog, trembles with physical ailments, and rages at his general's failures. He is still the figure responsible for the immense tragedy of the era, but he is shown as uncomfortably mortal. The film ignited Germany's fiercest cultural debate since reunification. Critics accused the film of humanizing a figure of evil, but the film posed a deeper question. Horrific acts are not committed by mythical monsters, but by people who make monstrous choices. By stripping their national symbol of evil of his mythic power, Downfall forced a new generation to confront how ordinary humans can be capable of extraordinary deeds of destruction. The final forbidden truth was perhaps the most intimate and fiercely rejected: the moral complexity of a survivor. Max Faberbach's 2008 film, Anonyma, a woman in Berlin, adapted the anonymous diary of a woman who survived the brutal occupation of Berlin in 1945. The film details how, in an environment of constant peril, the protagonist must make pragmatic and chilling choices to stay alive. She seeks out a high-ranking officer to form a protective arrangement in exchange for safety and food. The film does not portray her as a simple tragic heroine, but as a clear-eyed, calculating survivor who uses the only means available to her. The German public reacted with fury. Critics called it historical pornography, The film violated the cherished post-war myth of the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, as pure, noble victims. Internationally, it was acclaimed for its unflinching honesty, but at home, it was a box office disaster. The antidote was, for many, simply too bitter to swallow. Between the clear, ideological poison of the era and the difficult, confrontational antidote of the post-war period, there exists a third, deeply unsettling category of forbidden cinema, the gray zone. These are films that defy easy categorization, works of art so morally ambiguous that they have been accused of being both a critique of the regime and a form of its continuation. They are dangerous because they explore the darkest corners of human psychology in the shadow of that time, leaving the audience without a clear moral compass. Liliana Cavani's 1974 film, The Night Porter, is the ultimate example. The story begins in a Vienna hotel, years after the war, where two people meet again, bound by a shared, traumatic past. What follows is not a story of healing, but the voluntary resumption of a deeply disturbing and complex dynamic of power and submission. The film suggests that extreme trauma can forge powerful bonds that defy conventional morality. European censors panicked. The film was banned outright in several countries. Critics were, and remain, fiercely divided. Some see it as a profound exploration of trauma bonding. Others condemn it as exploitation. The film is the antidote in that it confronts deep psychological scars, but it is also accused of being a poison, finding a dark allure in the power dynamics of that regime. Equally complex is Luchino Visconti's 1969 operatic epic, The Damned. The film charts the moral decay of a wealthy German Steel dynasty as they make a pact with the rising party to secure their fortune. Their internal corruption, a world of greed, power struggles, and family betrayal, is presented as a mirror for the nation's own moral descent. German censors effectively banned it, accusing the director of anti-German propaganda. But even critics sympathetic to the film's anti-regime message struggled with its central thesis. Visconti visually connects the family's internal collapse with their embrace of political evil, a connection that felt uncomfortably close to the regime's own ideology. The films of the gray zone are the most challenging of all, as they force us to question the very line between confronting darkness and becoming lost within it. When we look at these three distinct acts of German film history, the poison, the antidote, and the gray zone, a powerful and deeply sobering conclusion emerges. Cinema is not mere entertainment. It is one of the most potent tools ever created by humanity, capable of both mass psychological manipulation and the most profound confrontation with truth. The films of the Nazi era serve as an eternal, terrifying warning of how easily an audience can be seduced by a powerful aesthetic, how documentary techniques can be weaponized to systematically erase a group's identity, and how historical drama can be used to make terrible acts seem justified. They are a stark reminder that the most effective poison does not always taste bitter. It can often be sweet and intoxicating. On the other hand, the controversial post-war films demonstrate the essential and courageous power of cinema as the only possible antidote. They teach us that history is rarely a simple story of good versus evil. They force us to find the flicker of humanity in the most uncomfortable of places, whether it's inside a German U-boat or inside the dictator's bunker, and to recognize the agonizing moral complexity in the choices of survivors. These films remain dangerous today, not because they condone evil, but because they deny us the comfort of easy answers. The poison told us a simple and beautiful lie. The antidote and the films of the gray zone force us to confront an ugly, complex, and profoundly human truth.